I am proud to create him Prince of Wales, Tywysog Cymru, the country whose title I've been so greatly privileged to bear during so much of my life and duty.
King Charles has reportedly overruled everything behind palace doors. Inside King Charles III's circle, a shocking order has been issued. A historic diamond brooch collection is being transferred to Catherine, triggering immediate questions across royal watchers. Why now? And what does this signal about Queen Camilla's position inside the monarchy? Join us as we break down the decision that has the royal world talking. The meeting that changed everything. King Charles was seated among royal trustees and senior advisors when the meeting began. To anyone observing the room from the outside, it looked like another matter of household administration, the kind of gathering that happens regularly inside a working monarchy, structured, formal, and mostly invisible to the world beyond the palace gates. But the people who understand how the royal machine operates knew this was different. The atmosphere in the room was not the atmosphere of routine management. It carried the weight that only surfaces when the topic is succession, inheritance, or the kind of institutional decision that outlasts everyone making it. At the center of the discussion was Camilla's diamond brooch collection, a set of jewels that had become inseparable from her public identity across the years of her marriage to Charles.
On the 9th of April 2005, Charles and Camilla married in a civil ceremony.
Pieces that had appeared during major state moments, at national ceremonies, at the kind of occasions where what a royal wears carries more weight than anything they say. These jewels were not just beautiful adornments. They were visible declarations of position and belonging. Catherine had been summoned to the meeting. By the accounts of people close to the situation, she was not expecting the full weight of what she was about to hear. The king had reached a private conclusion. Certain pieces within the collection were tied not to personal comfort, but to royal duty and institutional continuity, and in that distinction, everything had already been decided. By the time Catherine left the room, the documents that palace staff had reportedly prepared before she even arrived were already moving through trusted hands. Senior aides who knew what the preparation of those documents meant understood immediately. This decision had not been made that morning. It had been building for months, perhaps longer, assembled quietly in the background, while the public world of the royal family continued its visible routines. By evening, the whispers racing through palace corridors had changed in character. People had stopped asking whether a transfer would happen. They were asking why now, why Catherine, and why Charles had chosen this particular moment to draw such a clear and deliberate line between personal affection and institutional duty. And behind all those questions sat the harder one that nobody in those corridors wanted to say directly. What did this mean for Camilla? What those jewels actually meant? The diamond brooches did not become central to this story because of their financial value or their physical beauty. They became central because of what they represented in language that royal institutions have always used to communicate the things they cannot say out loud. For generations, royal jewelry has never been simply ornamental. A brooch pinned at a state occasion can communicate more than any formal announcement. A piece worn at the right moment signals continuity, approval, loyalty. A piece withheld or moved or placed in different hands signals something else entirely. Every brooch in Camilla's collection carried history. Some had appeared during solemn national events. Some had been worn during the slow and difficult years when she was transitioning from the most controversial figure in the royal family into its queen.
Camilla, the most controversial person among the monarchs.
Each piece had become associated with a specific chapter of that journey, and the wearing of them had been part of how the palace had gradually constructed the narrative of her acceptance. That was the question that had quietly been building inside royal circles for some time. Were these pieces personal property, tied to the woman who wore them and the private life she had built beside Charles? Or were they part of something larger, part of the crown's wider story, part of the institutional furniture that outlasts every individual who comes into contact with it? In the royal world, that question is not abstract. Personal jewels follow the person, institutional jewels follow duty, and once that distinction is applied to a specific collection, the conversation that follows is no longer a family matter. It becomes a formal process with formal consequences. Somewhere in that process, Catherine's name had begun to carry a different weight. She was the Princess of Wales.
With Catherine beside him, our new Prince and Princess of Wales will, I know.
She was increasingly understood, within the palace and by the public watching from outside it, as the future guardian of the monarchy's emotional identity, the person who would carry its image into the next reign, the person who had demonstrated, through years of disciplined and quietly impressive public service, that she understood what the crown required and was prepared to give it. And once that understanding settled into the formal review of the collection, certain conclusions became very difficult to avoid. So, what does it actually mean for her position now? Camilla's position and the quiet pressure building around her. Camilla's rise had never been simple. She had spent years on the wrong side of public opinion, carrying the weight of a role that the British public had initially refused to accept. The journey from that starting point to Queen Consort was long.
Camilla is now the Queen, kind of. The new king's darling wife has become the Queen Consort.
And at every stage it had required the active protection and support of Charles. He had stood beside her through the years of public doubt. He had guided her toward acceptance, one careful appearance at a time. He had watched her become, gradually, and against significant resistance, a royal figure whom people had come to treat with something approaching respect. That transformation had been real, and it had cost both of them something to achieve it. But inside the palace, acceptance and authority had never been the same thing. Acceptance meant she had a place. Authority meant she could shape what came next. And as the question of succession planning became harder to ignore in the corridors of the royal household, those two different things began to separate in ways that nobody could prevent. William and Catherine's presence in the royal landscape had been growing stronger with each passing year. Not loudly, not through declarations or maneuvers that could be easily identified and challenged, but steadily, undeniably, in the way that tomorrow always becomes more real as today moves toward it. They represented the next reign, and in a monarchy built on continuity, the next reign is always the most important thing in the room, even when it is not the one currently wearing the crown. Camilla's supporters inside the palace had watched this with their own particular anxiety. The brooch collection, to them, represented something concrete and visible about her position. These were jewels she had worn publicly, repeatedly, at the moments when the palace had been most deliberately constructing the image of her as queen. They were woven into the visual record of who she had become. To lose them, or to have them formally reviewed and redirected, would not simply be an administrative adjustment. It would be a statement, and inside royal circles, statements made through symbols are never accidental. They are calculated communications delivered through the most durable medium available. Charles understood this. He understood the personal pain that would accompany any such decision and what it would mean for the woman who had stood beside him through everything. And he sat with that understanding, while the advisors around him presented their conclusions in the cold, precise language of institutional duty. But understanding the weight of a decision is not the same as escaping it. Even when every personal cost is clear, institutional choices still have to be made, and once the argument is framed in duty rather than emotion, there is very little room left for hesitation. The decision and what drove it. When the formal recommendation reached Charles, the advisors presenting it had reportedly spent months doing the preparation. Royal protocols were not only reviewed, historical precedents were also examined, and succession traditions considered from every relevant angle. The conclusion they delivered was both straightforward in its logic and explosive in its implications. If the monarchy's future was the governing priority, the collection needed a new custodian. The advisors were not asking Charles to make a personal judgment about Camilla or Catherine as women. They were asking him to make an institutional judgment about possession versus preservation. In the royal world, those two things are understood very differently. Ownership can be temporary. Stewardship is sacred. And once the question was framed that way, the weight of it shifted from the personal to the permanent. Charles had spent his entire adult life preparing to be king while watching the institution from the outside. He had studied its requirements from a distance for longer than almost anyone in modern history.
He cares about its heritage, he cares about the planet, and he cares about the people.
And now, sitting inside it, he was facing the specific demand that the crown makes of every monarch eventually. the demand to think beyond the present moment, beyond the people currently standing beside him, and toward the shape of what would remain when this particular reign was finished. The jewels, in that context, were not the subject. They were the vehicle through which the larger question was being answered. Who would carry the monarchy's symbols forward? Who could hold that history without turning it into personal victory? Who understood that the crown survives through continuity, not through individual possession? The answer the review produced pointed toward Catherine, not as a replacement for Camilla, not as a rebuke, but as the natural custodian of pieces that had become too deeply tied to the institution's future to remain in their current arrangement. For Charles, the moment was brutal in a very specific way. He was not choosing between two women he loved. He was choosing between what he felt and what his position required. Those two things had rarely been in greater conflict. The documents were prepared and the instructions were immediately given. The meeting was eventually convened, and when Catherine left the room carrying what she had just been told, the threshold had already been crossed. What had been discussed in private was already beginning to take shape in the structure of the institution itself, and the ripple effects were only just starting to reach the rest of the palace. The reaction. Inside the palace. The moment word began moving through the palace household, the atmosphere changed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when certain names came up. Alliances that had seemed fixed began to show their edges. Staff members who understood the machinery of royal procedure recognized what was happening before any official communication confirmed it. In the palace, silence has its own grammar. A careful phrase overheard in a corridor. A sudden pause when the collection is mentioned. A staff member lowering their voice where they previously would not have. These are the signals that precede formal announcements in an institution that has always preferred to let meaning travel through atmosphere rather than through words. Camilla's circle registered the change before anyone stated it directly. The sense that something precious was being moved away from her reached the people around her through exactly these signals. Not through a conversation or a letter or a statement, but through the specific quality of unease that settles into a household when a decision has been made, and the only question remaining is how it will be delivered. Palace aides reacted in different directions. Some saw the move as inevitable, a painful step that the trajectory of royal life had been making unavoidable for years. Others felt the weight of what it would mean for Camilla, whose public identity had been built in part through the careful association of these specific pieces with these specific moments in the monarchy's recent history. Royal observers outside the household turned their attention to the ceremonial implications. If Catherine became the new custodian of pieces formerly associated with Camilla, then every future state occasion would carry a new layer of meaning. A brooch that had appeared on Camilla during a significant national moment, reappearing on Catherine during a future one, would not simply be jewelry. It would be communication, the kind the palace delivers without anyone having to say a word. Camilla's supporters viewed this prospect with something close to alarm. Catherine's supporters viewed it as confirmation of what had been building for years. The divide between those two readings sharpened the atmosphere inside royal circles in ways that were difficult to contain. Above the immediate reactions, the larger significance of the reported decision was becoming clearer to everyone watching it. This was not an isolated household adjustment. It was a signal about the direction the institution was moving, delivered through the most durable symbolic language available to a monarchy. And once that signal had been sent, the question of what else had already been decided in the same quiet way became impossible to dismiss. Catherine's weight and what the transfer actually asked of her. For Catherine, the transfer was never going to be a simple acquisition. The pieces she was being asked to receive were not decorative additions to a personal collection. They were fragments of a specific history, weighted with the story of the woman who had worn them, and the years those pieces had spent becoming part of the public record of what the modern monarchy had been trying to become. Accepting them meant accepting the responsibility that came attached to them. Every future appearance in which those pieces appeared would be read. Every choice about when to wear them and when to leave them in a cabinet would carry meaning. Every silence on the subject would be interpreted. The jewels would not simply sit in her care. They would become part of the ongoing conversation about who she was and what the monarchy she was preparing to represent actually stood for.
Became destined to be the future Queen of England.
She had built her position across years of precisely this kind of careful navigation, the restraint she had demonstrated in her public role, the consistent prioritization of duty over personal visibility, the sense that she understood the weight of the symbols she was already carrying. These were the qualities that had made her the person the advisors named when the review concluded. But understanding something in the abstract and being handed the physical objects that make it concrete are different experiences. The brooches were not abstract. They were real, with real histories and real former owners and real implications for every future decision about when and how they appeared in public. What the transfer asked of Catherine was precisely what it appeared, on the surface, to be giving her. It asked her to hold beauty without making it look like victory, to inherit history without appearing to relish the inheriting, to carry symbols that had recently been associated with someone else in a way that honored that association rather than erasing it. The standard the palace was placing before her was one that left very little room for error. That was also why the decision strengthened her position in the way that the people observing it believed it had. The palace does not entrust difficult things to people it doubts. The complexity of what was being placed in her hands was itself a statement about the trust behind the placement. Charles, meanwhile, had reached the position that every monarch reaches eventually, the point at which personal loyalty and institutional responsibility are no longer pointing in the same direction. He had protected Camilla's place in public life across years of difficulty. He had stood beside her through controversies that might have ended a less determined alliance. He had watched her become, against genuine resistance, the queen beside him. And then the crown asked him to look past all of that, to look at the symbols of the institution he was responsible for, and ask who needed to hold them when his reign was finished. That question had one answer, and the answer had already been acted upon before most people inside the palace fully understood what was happening. What the diamonds were always saying. The brooches themselves will be put away eventually. The conversations around them will settle. The formal dispute, to whatever extent there was one, will resolve into the kind of institutional arrangement that becomes unremarkable once it has been in place long enough. But the moment will not be forgotten inside royal circles, because what happened was not really about jewelry. It was about the moment when a king stopped managing the present and started arranging the future, about the moment when symbols that had been held in one set of hands moved toward another because the institution required it, about the specific and unsparing demand that the crown makes of everyone who sits at its center, the demand to serve what outlasts you rather than what comforts you. Catherine walks forward carrying more than diamonds. She carries the expectation that she understands why they were moved and what that movement was saying. The palace was telling its own story through the pieces, the way it has always told the stories that matter most. Not through announcements or press statements or carefully managed interviews, but through the language of objects placed deliberately in deliberate hands at a deliberate moment. Camilla's name will remain part of that story. The pieces carried her history before they carried anything else, and that history does not disappear because the physical objects have changed their location. But the story is being continued by someone else now, with someone else at the center of the frame, and the palace has made clear whose hands it trusts with the weight of what comes next. Charles will have known, when the documents were signed and the instructions were given and the meeting was convened, that the decision would cost something, that it would create pain in the room where Camilla was, that it would send a message beyond what any formal statement could have said. And he made it anyway, because the crown had asked him to, and because that is what wearing a crown has always required. The era it is preparing for is not yet here, but the preparation is already underway, and the diamonds, wherever they are sitting at this particular moment, are part of the evidence that the next chapter has already quietly begun. Now let's talk about why Camilla never stood a chance. The court of public opinion. Queen consort. Camilla's public image is one of the most complicated in modern royal history, not because of what she does today, but because of the story that surrounded her long before she took on her current role. For many people, her name became tied to one of the most painful chapters in royal history, the breakdown of Prince Charles and Princess Diana's marriage.
For what the media dubbed the wedding of the century.
That connection changed how she was seen for years. Even before she became queen consort, she was already part of a story that the public had strong emotions about, and those emotions did not fade easily. Over time, efforts were made to change that image. Camilla began taking on more public duties, supporting charities, and keeping a lower profile. The goal was simple: show her as she is today, not only as she was once seen. And in many ways, that worked on the surface. Her role became more normal within the royal family, and she gradually moved from being highly controversial to more accepted in official settings. But public feeling is not just about official roles. It is also about memory. For a large part of the public, the story of Diana and Charles is still emotionally strong, and Camilla is still connected to it. That makes her image harder to fully reshape, no matter how much time passes or how many positive roles she takes on. This is why years of reputation rebuilding have not completely changed how she is viewed. The efforts did improve her position within the institution, but they could not fully replace the original story people remember. Once a public image becomes tied to a powerful emotional narrative, it is difficult to erase it completely. Today, Camilla exists in two different ways in public opinion. Inside the royal family, she is seen as a steady and respected figure who has earned her place. Outside of it, opinions are still mixed, shaped as much by history as by her present actions. The result is a reputation that has improved over time, but never fully escaped its origins. What do you think this moment reveals about where the monarchy is heading? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.